A rich man saw a boy identical to his deceased son crying in the rain. When he approached, the boy revealed something that made the millionaire break down in tears. The afternoon seemed quiet in Andrew's office. A 45-year-old man who built his empire from scratch. The grey hair at his temples revealed the worries of a life dedicated to business, but his green eyes still maintained the glow of someone who found joy in small things, especially in the smile of his son Ethan, just 5 years old. He was analyzing some contracts when he found among the papers a drawing of him with his father in a park, made during the walk with Olivia. Andrew smiled, thinking about how his second wife, after 2 years of marriage, finally seemed to be connecting with the boy. "I'll bring him some ice cream when I get home," Andrew thought, holding the picture frame on the desk. Ethan has been so happy lately. Maybe Olivia is really the mother he needed after Maria left us. Minutes later, the phone rang, a call. Andrew answered absent-mindedly, still looking at the drawing of his son. On the other end of the line, Olivia's voice sounded unrecognizable, choked and interrupted by violent sobs. His fingers gripped the phone so hard that his knuckles turned white. Her words seemed to come from far away. Accident, hospital, Ethan. The world began to spin, and he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. His secretary entered the room upon hearing the noise of the falling chair, finding him already running for the door. "No, it can't be true," his mind screamed as he ran to the elevator. "I found a drawing of his just a few minutes ago. He was okay. My son was okay." The journey to the hospital was a blur of red lights, honking horns, and an anguish that threatened to tear his heart from his chest. Andrew exceeded all speed limits, ignoring red lights with his cell phone ringing incessantly, calls from Olivia that he couldn't answer. His hands were shaking so hard on the steering wheel that twice he almost crashed. In his mind, he repeated like a mantra the last words he said to his son that morning. "Be good to Olivia, champ. Daddy will pick you up later for ice cream." His voice choked as he remembered his son's smile. "Please, God, don't take my boy from me. He's all I have." In the hospital parking lot, Andrew could barely stop the car properly. He ran through the emergency room looking for any sign of Olivia or Ethan. The smell of antiseptic and the white walls seemed to suffocate him. A nurse tried to stop him, asking him to calm down, but he ignored her, shouting his son's name down the hallways. That's when he saw Olivia. "Andrew!" she shouted from one of the rooms, her face marked by small cuts and tears. "Forgive me, I tried, but he didn't. He didn't." Olivia was sitting on a gurney, with some superficial scratches being treated by a nurse. Her face was pale, except for her red, swollen eyes from crying so much. She tried to get up when she saw Andrew, but her legs failed. He held her by the shoulders, shaking her gently, demanding answers. Her words came out broken by sobs that grew more intense. "It all happened so fast, Andrew. A car cut us off. I tried to swerve. Ethan was in the back seat. The doctors tried, but..." She couldn't finish the sentence, breaking down in tears in his arms. "Our boy is gone, Andrew. Our little one is gone." Andrew's world crumbled with those words. His legs gave out and he slid down the wall to the floor, dragging Olivia with him. The hospital corridor continued its frantic movement, but for him everything had stopped. Nurses and doctors passed like shadows. Their voices made no more sense. His chest burned with a pain that no words could describe. Silent tears streamed down his face. "Where is my son?" His voice came out as a broken whisper. "I need to see my son, Olivia. I need to see my Ethan." Olivia held him even tighter, her body shaking with increasingly intense sobs. The small cuts on her face were still bleeding slightly, staining Andrew's white shirt. She shook her head negatively, clinging to him as if her life depended on it. Her eyes, when they met his, carried a shadow Andrew had never seen before. "You can't see him like that, my love," she whispered between sobs. "I've already arranged everything. The funeral home has already taken him. I don't want you to remember him like that. I can't let you see our boy that way." The doctor approached them, a middle-aged man with deep circles under his eyes and a tired expression. In his hands, a clipboard trembled slightly. He knelt beside the couple, his voice trying to maintain a professional tone, but failing to hide the emotion. Andrew clung to the doctor's words like a man clings to a thread of hope in the midst of a nightmare. "We did everything in our power, sir." The doctor paused, searching for the right words. The injuries were too severe. Your son didn't suffer. It was instantaneous. The hospital corridor began to spin, and Andrew felt a wave of nausea rising in his throat. The doctor's words echoed in his mind like a death sentence. Olivia hugged him tighter, her tears wetting his neck. The picture frame he was still holding in one hand fell, the glass shattering on the hospital floor. "It can't be true," Andrew murmured, his voice choked with pain. "My son was fine at home a few hours ago. He was going to have ice cream with me today. How can he not be here anymore?" Olivia got up with difficulty, pulling Andrew with her. Her face was marked not only by cuts, but by an expression that mixed pain and something else, something Andrew couldn't define in his state of shock. She held his face between her hands, forcing him to look into her eyes. "We need to be strong now," she said, her voice trembling. "Ethan, he wouldn't want to see us like this. Let's go home. You need to rest. The funeral home will take care of everything." The next few hours passed in a confused blur in Andrew's mind. Papers were signed, decisions were made, but he barely remembered anything. Olivia took control of everything, her efficiency surprising amidst the chaos. The sound of her cell phone ringing incessantly in the background seemed to come from another world. "How will I go on without him?" Andrew thought, as Olivia guided him through the parking lot. "How will I live in a world where my son no longer exists?" Far away, the first sensation was a sharp pain in his forehead that seemed to split his skull in half. Ethan tried to open his eyes, but only one obeyed. The other was stuck with something hot and viscous, dripping down his face. The dark alley spun around him, and his small fingers groped the damp ground, trying to find some support. The metallic taste in his mouth mingled with the smell of trash and gasoline. "Daddy?" His voice came out weak and trembling, almost a whisper. "Auntie Mari, why did you do this to me?" Flashes of the accident began to surface in his confused mind. The walk in the park, Olivia driving, her voice strangely calm saying she had a surprise. Then the steering wheel spinning sharply, the impact, the screams. His small 5-year-old hands clutched his head, trying to make the images stop spinning. Tears mixed with the liquid that wouldn't stop flowing from the cut on his forehead. "She said Daddy didn't love me anymore," he sobbed softly, trying to get up. "But Daddy was going to take me for ice cream today. She lied, didn't she?" The cold was starting to seep through his torn and dirty clothes. Ethan tried to lean against the alley wall, his wobbly legs barely able to support his weight. Every movement made his head throb even harder, and the shadows around him seemed to dance and turn into threatening monsters. The only sound was his own crying and the distant noise of cars. "I need to find Daddy," he thought, taking a trembling step. "But what's our street name again? Why can't I remember?" Ethan stumbled out of the alley, his small hands leaning against the dirty walls. The streetlights made his eyes hurt, and everything seemed to be covered in a red haze because of the liquid dripping from his forehead. People rushed by, some looking away, others not even noticing that small injured figure. The adult world continued its frantic pace, indifferent to his despair. "Please, someone help me," his childish voice could barely come out. "I want my dad." Why doesn't anyone hear me? His legs were shaking more and more, and the cold was turning into an uncontrollable shiver. Ethan tried to wipe the viscous liquid from his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt, but only managed to smear his bruised little face even more. Memories of the accident kept coming back in confused flashes. Olivia's strange smile in the rearview mirror, her talking on the phone about another boy who looked like him, the car suddenly turning towards the wall. She was talking to someone, he mumbled to himself, stumbling on a broken sidewalk. There was another boy, like me in the car. Why? Auntie Mari, why? The sky began to darken rapidly, and the first raindrops fell on his injured face. Ethan tried to focus on the street signs, but the letters danced before his eyes. Nothing made sense. His head hurt so much that every step was torture. A distant thunder rolled, making him cower in fear against a wall. "Daddy always says not to be afraid of thunder," he sobbed, hugging himself. "But where are you, Dad? Why can't I find our house?" The rain began to fall harder, soaking his already dirty and torn clothes. The blood on his face was now flowing faster, diluted by the rainwater. Ethan tried to stay conscious, but his vision was starting to darken at the edges. The streets were becoming deserted, and the noise of the storm drowned out his small sobs. Everything's spinning, he thought, his legs finally giving way, Daddy, and help me. It's all so dark." The storm was gaining strength, turning the streets into raging rivers. Ethan dragged himself along the sidewalk edges, trying to take shelter from the rain under the awnings of shops that were already closing. His 5-year-old body shivered violently, a mixture of cold, fear, and pain. The streetlights were starting to come on, casting scary shadows that seemed to chase after him. "The monsters are going to get me," he whispered through chattering teeth. "Daddy always looks under the bed to scare them away." But there's no Daddy now. Every step was a battle against the unconsciousness that threatened to overwhelm him. The cut on his forehead kept bleeding, and now a strong dizziness made the world spin faster and faster. Ethan tried to focus on the lights of the building windows, searching for something familiar, something that would make him remember the way home. But his confused mind could only relive the moment of the accident. "Auntie Murray was different today," he mumbled to himself, staggering. "She took that other boy first. He was crying just like me now." A new thunder split the sky, briefly illuminating the deserted street. Ethan screamed in fear, covering his ears with his injured hands. The rainwater now ran red down his face, and the metallic taste in his mouth grew stronger. His legs were shaking so hard they could barely hold him up, and each step seemed to drain his last reserves of strength. "There has to be someone," he whimpered, looking at the lit windows above him. "Please, someone. I'm so scared." The storm's strong wind carried plastic bags and leaves, dancing a macabre waltz around him. Ethan tried to call for help, but his voice was nothing more than a hoarse whisper, lost in the noise of the rain. The pain in his head was now so severe that even crying hurt. His small hands gripped a safety railing, trying to stay upright. "Why did Aunt Mari say Daddy doesn't love me anymore?" he thought, tears mixing with rain and blood. He promised ice cream. He never breaks his promises. Hours later, the funeral parlor was immersed in a heavy silence, broken only by the muffled sound of sobs and whispers. Andrew remained seated in the front row, his gaze fixed on the small white casket covered in flowers. His hands trembled as he held the last drawing Ethan had made, a portrait of the two of them in the park. Olivia circled the room like a watchful shadow, controlling every detail, every person who approached. How can it be so fast? Andrew thought, his tears staining the drawing. Yesterday he was here, laughing, playing. Today he's in this cold box. Olivia interrupted any attempt to approach. Her choked voice repeated the same story to each person who arrived. His face was badly injured, unrecognizable. We don't want people to keep that last image. She kept a protective hand on Andrew, as if shielding him from the world, while discreetly gesturing with the other for the funeral home staff to keep their distance. "You don't understand," she said between perfectly controlled tears. "Andrew wouldn't bear to see our little angel like that. We need to protect him from that pain." The hours dragged on like an eternity of pain. Through a haze of tears, Andrew watched as Olivia coordinated each moment with an almost robotic efficiency. She had organized everything in less than 24 hours. The wake, the flowers, the special casket that protected Ethan's dignity. Her face maintained a studied mask of grief, but her eyes were alert, controlling every movement in the parlor. "Why can't I see my son one last time?" Andrew muttered, his voice broken by despair. "What kind of father am I, that I can't even say goodbye properly?" Andrew's elderly aunt, a woman who had helped raise Ethan, tried to approach to say goodbye during a moment of Olivia's distraction. Her aged fingers barely touched the white wood when Olivia appeared at her side, gently but firmly pushing her away. The look exchanged between the two women carried a weight that Andrew, in his state of shock, did not notice. "It's better this way, ma'am," Olivia whispered with false sweetness. "Let's preserve the good memories of our little angel. Andrew couldn't bear to see anyone suffering anymore." A young, inexperienced funeral home employee discreetly commented to a colleague while arranging more flowers. Her words reached Andrew's ears like sharp needles. "I've never seen anything so fast in 10 years of work." The deceased's wife already had all the paperwork ready when she got here last night, even before she said, but was interrupted. "Quiet!" Her colleague hushed her abruptly, noticing Olivia approaching with firm steps. Andrew watched the scene as if trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. People approached him with empty words of condolence, but their eyes always drifted towards where Ethan was, as if they too questioned the haste and mystery. Olivia was now on the phone in a corner, whispering words he couldn't make out, her face a mask of studied concern. How does she manage to think of everything at a time like this? A voice in his mind questioned. Why does she seem so composed? The afternoon sun began to stream through the parlor windows as the pastor arrived for the ceremony. Before he could even open his Bible, Olivia was already at his side, whispering specific instructions. Andrew noticed how she emphasized, with tense gestures, that the ceremony should be brief. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the clergyman's arm, something that clashed with her apparent calm. "We cannot prolong my husband's suffering," she explained, her voice choked but firm. "He's barely holding on. We need to get this over with as soon as possible." Andrew's elderly aunt approached him again, her wrinkled hands gripping his tightly. Her tear-blurred eyes carried a concern that went beyond grief. She leaned in to say something, but Olivia appeared like a shadow between them, offering water and sedatives to the old woman. The moment was broken, but not before Andrew heard her worried whisper. "Something's wrong, my son." His aunt's trembling voice barely reached his ears. "You're Marie." Andrew tried to focus on his aunt's interrupted words, but his mind was too numbed by pain and the sedatives Olivia insisted on giving him every hour. The strong scent of flowers was starting to make him nauseous, and the voices around him seemed distant, as if coming from another world. His eyes couldn't settle anywhere, while his hands compulsively clutched Ethan's crumpled drawing. "Why can't I remember the last few hours clearly?" he thought, trying to organize his hazy thoughts. "It's like everything is happening too fast and too slow at the same time." A sudden movement caught his attention. Olivia was arguing in a low but tense voice with the funeral home employee near the door. The man seemed confused, repeatedly consulting a clipboard as she gestured impatiently. Andrew managed to catch fragments of the conversation that didn't seem to make sense, something about wrong schedules and duplicate paperwork. Olivia quickly ushered the man out of the parlor. "I don't want any bureaucratic issues disturbing my husband at this time," she said firmly upon her return. "I've taken care of everything, my love. You just need to focus on saying goodbye." The pastor began the ceremony, his monotonous voice filling the parlor with empty words of consolation. Andrew noticed how Olivia constantly checked her watch, her fingers nervously drumming on the purse she never let go. Every time someone approached too closely, she quickly intervened, redirecting their attention to the flower arrangements or the guest book. "It's so strange," Andrew's secretary murmured to a colleague, low enough for Olivia not to hear. Yesterday afternoon, she called to confirm all the details of the boy's life insurance policy. 3 days had passed, like a feverish blur of pain and confusion. Ethan dragged himself through the city streets, his small body constantly trembling, while the cut on his forehead now displayed greenish stains around it. The sweet and rotten smell of infection mingled with the cold sweat that trickled down his pale face. His clothes, still damp from the storm on the first day, clung to his body like a second icy skin. "Dad always says not to get caught in the rain," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse and weak. "But what's Dad's name again? Why can't I remember?" The night before had been the worst so far. Ethan found shelter in a cardboard box behind a restaurant, sharing space with rats vying for food scraps. The fear of the animals was lesser than his devastating hunger. His little hands shook so much they could barely bring the moldy bread pieces to his mouth. "It's burning a lot," he whimpered, touching his hot, swollen forehead. "Aunt Mary said Dad doesn't want me anymore, but it can't be true. Can it?" The street seemed an endless maze to his staggering steps. Ethan no longer distinguished day from night, everything blurred in a feverish haze. The cut on his forehead throbbed in the same rhythm as his racing heart, and dark spots danced in his vision. His parched, cracked lips murmured disconnected words as he tried to remember something, anything about his home. "There was a big tree in the backyard," he whispered, stumbling over his own feet. "And Dad always left a light on in the hallway." But what hallway? The fever kept rising, making his little body shake violently. Ethan leaned against the building's walls, leaving a trail of sweat and dirt wherever he went. People dodged him as if he were invisible, just another shadow on the city streets. In his confused mind, every strange face transformed into his father, then into Olivia's cruel expression. "Please, someone." His voice was no more than a hoarse whisper. "I have a dad. He must be looking for me. He has to be." Ethan used his last strength to drag himself to a bakery, drawn by the smell of fresh bread that made his empty stomach twist painfully. The window pane reflected an image he barely recognized, a small thin boy with a dirty, injured face, his eyes sunken and bright with fever. The cut on his forehead was now a swollen, dark line descending to his eyebrow. "I don't look like me anymore," he thought, pressing his hot forehead against the cool glass. "How will Dad find me if I don't even recognize myself?" Ethan's legs trembled so much they could barely support him. 3 days without proper food and clean water had consumed his childish strength. The infection spread a poisonous heat throughout his body, making the world spin in strange colors. The voices of people inside the bakery reached his ears distorted, as if he were underwater. "There's a strange boy at the window," someone commented inside. "Oh my God, he's unwell. Quick, call someone." The heat of the fever was now unbearable, as if he were burning from the inside. Ethan tried to take another step, but his legs finally gave out. The world began to darken at the edges of his vision as his small, battered body slid down the bakery window. In his last moments of consciousness, he caught a glimpse of his father's face. "Dad?" His voice was just a breath. "Help me." The cold pavement approached rapidly as Ethan struggled to keep his eyes open. His whole body burned with invisible flames of fever, yet a terrible chill made his teeth chatter. The memories of the last few days blurred in his fevered mind. The icy rain, the rats fighting over food, the endless nights of fear and loneliness. "I wish I could remember our address," he thought, as hot tears streamed down his dirty face. The world around him began to spin faster, the colors blending like a broken kaleidoscope. Ethan could hear hurried voices coming from the bakery, rushed footsteps approaching, but everything seemed so distant, so unreal. His little body trembled with violent spasms, the infection now fully spread. "I just wanted to go home," he whispered to no one in particular. "I'm so scared, so cold." The smell of fresh bread, once so inviting, now turned his empty stomach. Ethan tried to cling to consciousness, his little hands scratching at the window pane in a last, desperate attempt to stay upright. The image of his father playing with him at the park flickered in his mind, like an old broken film reel. "We were going to get ice cream that day," he mumbled, his voice growing weaker. "Why did Aunt Mary lie to me, Dad? Why did she do this to us?" Ethan's legs finally gave out completely, and his small body slid to the ground like a rag doll. The world was now just a blur of dancing lights and shadows. The infected, throbbing cut on his forehead seemed to have a life of its own, sending waves of pain through his fevered body. "Dad always takes care of me when I'm sick." His mind wandered in delirium. He put superhero bandages on and blows to make it better, but now it hurt so much. Shapes formed around him, people from the bakery who had finally noticed that small, fallen figure. Ethan tried to focus his eyes on them, but every face transformed into his father's, then Olivia's, in an endless cycle of hope and terror. Cold sweat mingled with tears, and 3 days' worth of grime streamed down his face. "There's a boy passing out here outside," a distant voice shouted. "Oh my God, he's passing out." The frozen asphalt against his face was the only point of reality that Ethan could still cling to. The memories of the last few days mingled, Olivia's cruel smile in the rearview mirror, the impact of the car, the nights alone in the rain, the hunger, the fear. His small, trembling hand tried to reach for something invisible in the air. "I tried to be strong like you taught me, Dad," he whispered as the darkness began to engulf him. "But I'm so tired." "So," he said, before passing out completely. Victoria was leaving her night shift at the hospital when she saw the small crowd forming in front of the bakery. Her tired eyes from 12 hours of work barely registered the movement until she heard the cries for help. She approached quickly, her bag still slung over her shoulder, and her heart stopped when she saw the fallen boy. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old. He was dirty, injured, and burning with fever. "My God, this child needs urgent help," she thought, kneeling beside him. "This infection. How long has he been like this?" Her years of experience in the pediatric emergency room made Victoria act automatically. She checked the boy's vital signs: weak and irregular pulse, shallow breathing, hot and sticky skin. The cut on his forehead was in critical condition, with clear signs of severe infection. Her experienced hands gently touched the child's dirty and injured face. "The fever must be above normal," she murmured to herself. If I take him to the hospital in this condition, they will certainly call the assistants to take him to a shelter, where he will not be properly cared for. Victoria made a snap decision upon hearing the distant ambulance sirens. Carefully, she wrapped the small unconscious body in her coat and lifted him into her arms. The boy weighed alarmingly little, and his body trembled with violent fever spasms. She knew she was breaking every medical protocol, but something in her heart told her this child needed protection more than bureaucracy. "It'll be okay, little one," she whispered, hastening her steps to her car. "I won't let anyone hurt you again. Whoever did this to you?" The drive to her apartment was tense, with Victoria dividing her attention between the traffic and the unconscious boy in her lap. Every moan from him made her heart ache. In her mind, she was already listing all the medications she had at home from the hospital: antibiotics, fever reducers, dressing materials. She'd need it all and more. Who could abandon a child like this? She thought, watching his bruised face in the rearview mirror. Victoria's small apartment had never felt so welcoming. Carefully, she carried the boy inside, laying him on her bed. Her hands shook as she prepared the materials to clean the wound. The infection was worse than she'd imagined. The cut would need stitches, but doing that at home would be too risky. "I need to get this fever down first," she muttered, preparing a cold compress. "What's the point of having hospital equipment at home if I can't use it, when I really need to?" Victoria began gently cleaning the cut on Ethan's forehead, her experienced hands trembling slightly at the severity of the infection. The boy twisted with each touch, even unconscious, and tears streamed down his dirty face as he deliriated. Years of experience in pediatrics hadn't prepared Victoria for the anguish of seeing such a small child in so much suffering. "Shh, my angel," she whispered, carefully applying the antiseptic. "I know it hurts, but I need to clean this properly. What kind of monster does this to a child?" The cleaning process revealed more than just the wound. There were marks of violence, small bruises that told a dark story. Victoria had to take several deep breaths to hold back her tears as she worked. Her nurse's mind catalogued each mark, each sign, building a picture of the trauma this small body had endured. "These marks aren't just from the accident," she thought, examining the boy's arms. "There's something very wrong with this whole story. Is that why he ran away?" The injectable antibiotic Victoria kept for emergencies was now proving vital. With steady hands, she prepared the medication, silently thanking herself for keeping a small stock of drugs at home. The boy barely moved when the needle pierced his skin, a worrying sign of his weakened state. "If this fever doesn't go down in an hour, I'll have to risk taking him to the hospital," she muttered, checking his temperature again. "Please, little one, fight. Help me help you." Victoria was arranging another cold compress as she watched the boy toss and turn in fever. The room looked like a small makeshift ICU, with used syringes, compresses, and bottles of medication scattered across the nightstand. Her nimble hands worked tirelessly, alternating between checking his temperature and trying to get him to swallow water with a dropper to combat severe dehydration. "Those are expensive brand clothes, even all dirty," she thought, changing the dressing on his forehead. "He comes from money, so why was he abandoned like that?" The boy's delirium worsened by the minute. His words, once confused and jumbled, began forming sentences that made Victoria's heart ache. It was a tale of betrayal and abandonment no child should ever live, let alone at such a young age. She lied. She lied. The little one muttered, thrashing in the bed. "Daddy would never leave me. He promised ice cream." One detail caught Victoria's eye as she cleaned the boy's face. On the soiled collar of his shirt was a private school tag, but the name had been completely erased. Her experienced hands continued the mechanical work of fighting the infection, while her mind tried to piece together the puzzle. "Who could hurt a child like this?" she whispered, applying more antibiotic. The first night after the funeral was a waking nightmare for Andrew. The house, once full of laughter and life, now echoed a deafening silence. His shuffling steps down the hallway were those of a much older man as he avoided looking at Ethan's closed bedroom door. The toys still scattered around the living room, a red car under the couch, a ball in the corner, were like little stabs in his heart. "Just yesterday he was here," he whispered to the emptiness, picking up the car. "How can an entire life end in less than 24 hours? The smell of the dinner Olivia was cooking wafted in from the kitchen, but the thought of eating turned his stomach. Andrew let himself fall onto the couch, still wearing his black funeral suit. In his hands, the last drawing Ethan had sent from the park was crumpled from being held so much. Tears stained the paper, blurring the cheerful colors. "I couldn't even see your little face one last time," he thought, his voice choked up. Why did it have to be so fast? Exhaustion finally overcame him, and Andrew drifted into a restless sleep right there on the couch. The nightmare came instantly, the car crashing, distant screams, him running in slow motion trying to reach Ethan. But every time he got close, his son's face was shrouded in shadows, impossible to see. "Ethan!" He woke up screaming, heart pounding. "Son, please, come back." The sound of Olivia's footsteps echoed through the room, quick and precise. She emerged with a glass of water and more pills, her face a perfect mask of concern. Andrew noticed, even in his confused state, how she had already changed from her funeral clothes into casual attire, as if she wanted to erase any trace of that terrible day. "You need to take your medication, love," she insisted, her voice melodious but firm. "The doctor said we need to avoid these anxiety attacks." Andrew pushed the pills away with a trembling hand, rising from the couch in an abrupt motion. His feet automatically led him to Ethan's bedroom door. The white wood, decorated with superhero stickers, seemed to pulse before his eyes. His hand touched the doorknob, but he couldn't turn it. "I can't go in there," he muttered, leaning his forehead against the door. "If I go in and see the empty bed, I'll have to accept that it's real." Olivia approached from behind, placing her hands on his shoulders, with a pressure that seemed more of a warning than comfort. Her fingers gripped lightly as Andrew made to turn the knob, and her voice sounded strangely controlled. "Maybe it's better to leave the room closed for now," she suggested, gently pulling him back. "Tomorrow we can start organizing things, donating the toys." "Donate?" Andrew's voice came out as a broken roar, causing Olivia to step back. The thought of strangers touching Ethan's toys, taking his things away, made his stomach churn. In an impulsive motion, he turned the knob and pushed the door open, ignoring the sharp sound of protest that Olivia let out. "No one is going to touch anything here." His voice trembled as much as his legs. "This room, these things, it's all I have left of him." The room was exactly as Ethan had left it the previous morning. The unmade bed with the Spider-Man pajamas tossed on the pillow, the tiny sneakers side by side near the desk, colored pencils scattered over an unfinished drawing. His scent still lingered there, that mix of children's shampoo and the cologne he loved to wear to smell like Daddy. How can everything be the same? Andrew thought, his legs finally giving way under the weight of reality. How can it look like he's about to come running through that door at any moment? Olivia stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the light from the hallway. There was something strange about her posture, a tension that didn't match the moment. Her eyes quickly scanned the room, as if looking for something specific, while her hands twisted together. "Andrew, love, you're getting agitated," she tried again, her voice too controlled. "Let's get out of here, take the medication and try to rest. Tomorrow will be another day." Andrew dragged himself to Ethan's desk, his trembling fingers touching each colored pencil left there. The unfinished drawing showed what looked like the park, where they used to spend their afternoons. The same big tree, the swing, two hand-holding figures he recognized as himself and his son. But there was something else in the other scattered papers, something his tear-blurred eyes could barely focus on. "He always drew everything that happened," he whispered to himself, gathering the sheets. It was his way of telling things when he was scared. Olivia moved quickly towards the desk, but Andrew was already flipping through the drawings. His hands abruptly stopped on a sheet partially hidden under the pencil case. The paper was crumpled, as if someone had tried to destroy it in a hurry. The colors were darker than usual in Ethan's cheerful drawings. "You don't need to look at this now." Olivia tried to take the paper from his hands, her voice rising an octave. "They're just scribbles. He was having nightmares." Andrew's heart stopped as he unfolded the drawing completely. There, in a child's strokes but chillingly clear, was Olivia. But it wasn't the sweet Olivia everyone knew. The figure had red eyes, large and menacing, a twisted smile that seemed more like a scar across her face, and her hands. Her hands were raised towards a small huddled figure in the corner of the paper. "What is this?" Andrew muttered, his voice barely audible. Why did Ethan draw you like this?" Andrew's eyes traced every detail of that disturbing drawing, his brain trying to process what he was seeing. The small figure in the corner, which could only be Ethan, was crying. Blue tears streamed down the pencil-drawn face. There were words written in a child's uneven handwriting. "She lies." The paper shook in his hands as more details emerged. Red marks on the drawing of the boy, a black car in the background. Ethan never drew anything like this before. His voice came out strangled. "What nightmares were those you mentioned? Why didn't you tell me about them?" Olivia moved like lightning, trying to snatch the paper from Andrew's hands. Her face, once a mask of concern, now showed something different, a mixture of anger and fear he had never seen before. In the struggle for the drawing, other papers fell to the floor, revealing more disturbing images hidden beneath the pile. "They're just children's drawings," she practically yelled, her voice losing its usual sweet tone. "He was just being imaginative, making up stories. You know how kids are." Andrew bent down to pick up the other scattered drawings, but Olivia was faster. In seconds, she was gathering all the papers, crumpling them and stuffing them into her coat pocket. Her hands were trembling, but her movements were precise, almost rehearsed. The only drawing left in Andrew's hands was that first one, with the red eyes that seemed to stare back at him. The time at the mansion had turned into a confusing blur for Andrew. Each meal was followed by heavy drowsiness. Every glass of water had a slightly bitter taste that he barely noticed. His thoughts were always foggy, except when he saw Ethan. The boy appeared in the corners of the rooms, laughing and running, only to disappear when he tried to reach him. Olivia said they were grief-induced hallucinations, that he needed to increase his medication. "You're not real," he muttered to the small figure playing near the stairs. "But why does it seem so alive? Why can I even hear your laughter?" Breakfast was always the same: porridge, orange juice, and the pills Olivia insisted he take in front of her. That morning, however, something was different. The fog in his mind seemed to clear for a moment when he saw Ethan sitting in his usual chair, insistently pointing at the food with a warning expression. "Daddy, she's doing it again." His son's voice sounded so real that Andrew almost dropped his spoon. "Like in the drawing, remember? She lies." Andrew shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. Ethan's image disappeared, but his words echoed in his mind along with the memory of the disturbing drawing. With trembling hands, he stirred the porridge and noticed something strange: small white granules that didn't dissolve completely. His stomach turned as he realized the same residue was at the bottom of the juice glass. "How long has she been doing this?" he thought, feeling a cold sweat run down his spine. "That's why I can't think straight. That's why I see things." Olivia entered the kitchen humming, her face a perfect mask of serenity. Andrew continued stirring the food, pretending to eat, while watching her arrange a series of medicine bottles on the counter. His eyes tried to focus on the names on the labels, but his vision was still blurred from the previous day's medications. "You need to eat it all, love," she said, with that sweet voice that now sounded false. "You've been so weak. You need to eat for the pills to take effect." When she turned her back, Andrew quickly poured part of the porridge onto a napkin, stuffing it in the pocket of his robe. The next pill she brought, he pretended to swallow, hiding it in his cheek. His heart was beating so hard he was sure she could hear it. The image of Ethan's drawing kept flashing in his mind. "Are you feeling better?" Olivia asked, her eyes studying his every move. "Soon you'll feel calmer, more controllable." The word controllable echoed in Andrew's mind like an alarm. His hands were shaking, but now it wasn't from the effects of the pills. It was pure, cruel fear. Olivia continued her routine around the kitchen, but her movements seemed different now that the fog was starting to lift from his mind. There was something calculated, almost mechanical, in the way she measured the times, checked the bottles, watched his reactions. "Would you like some more juice, darling?" she asked with that syrupy voice. "We still have those anxiety pills the doctor prescribed." Andrew shook his head, feeling the unswallowed pill scratch his cheek. He forced himself to appear drowsy, letting his shoulders slump as they always did after meals. The sound of the spoon hitting the cup as Olivia prepared another tea seemed deafening to his alert ears. "I need to find out what she's doing to me," he thought, struggling to keep his expression blank. The kitchen began to spin slightly, a remnant of the previous day's medication still in his system. At the door, Ethan's figure appeared again, but this time Andrew didn't try to ignore it. The boy was frantically pointing to a specific drawer, the same one Olivia always kept locked. Her meds are in there, Dad. Ethan's voice sounded in his mind. She keeps everything there, just like she used to with me. The following minutes were an exercise in self-control for Andrew. Each time Olivia approached with more pills, he pretended to swallow, hiding them in different places, inside the robe's lining, under his tongue, in his cheek. His body was still heavy from the previous medication, but his mind was beginning to clear for the first time in days. The hallucinations of Ethan now seemed more like warnings than delusions. "You're so quiet today," Olivia commented, her eyes narrowed, studying him. "Maybe you need an extra dose to calm down." Andrew waited until Olivia went upstairs to change the bedding, a ritual she insisted on maintaining every day. With calculated, unsteady steps, he stumbled to the drawer Ethan had indicated. His hands were shaking as he forced the lock with a utensil, praying the sound of running water upstairs would mask his movements. "My God," he whispered as he saw the contents of the drawer. "They're all controlled medications. How long has she been giving me these drugs?" The sound of Olivia's footsteps on the stairs made Andrew freeze. Quickly, he took photos of the bottles with the cell phone she forgot to confiscate when he was more doped up. Under the medications, he found something that made his blood run cold. A notebook with detailed notes on times, doses, and reactions. Not just his, but Ethan's too. "Looking for something, dear?" Olivia's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I found the pills you've been hiding in your room." Olivia's smile disappeared like a mask falling. In her hands, a small plastic bag full of the pills Andrew had pretended to take. Her eyes, once always sweet, now had that red gleam Ethan had captured in his drawing. Andrew tried to get up, but his legs were still too weak from the previous medication. "You don't understand, Andrew." Her voice was icy now. "I do this for your own good. You haven't been thinking straight since Ethan. Well, you know." With surprising strength, Olivia grabbed Andrew's arm, dragging him towards the basement. He tried to resist, but years of medication had weakened his muscles. The heavy basement door creaked ominously, revealing stairs descending into darkness. "You need some time to think," she said, pushing him down the stairs. "To understand that everything I do is out of love." Andrew stumbled down the steps, leaning against the damp wall to keep from falling. The thud of the door closing sounded like a final sentence, followed by the metallic click of the key turning in the lock. The darkness of the basement was almost complete, except for a sliver of light coming from a small boarded-up window. "I'll leave you here until you calm down." Olivia's voice came muffled through the door. "Until you understand that you need the medication, that you need me," she said, leaving him locked in the dark. Victoria was racing against time as Ethan thrashed in bed, his tiny forehead burning with a fever that refused to break. The IV antibiotic dripped slowly into the thin vein of his arm, but the infection seemed stronger than any medication. The early morning hours dragged like a dark eternity, as Victoria changed compresses and checked the boy's vitals with the mechanical precision years of experience had given her. His small body trembled violently, his once rosy skin now taking on an ashen tone that made her heart ache. "Please hang in there, little one," Victoria whispered, changing the infected dressing once more. The improvised blood pressure monitor that Victoria had managed to borrow from the hospital started beeping in an irregular and worrying rhythm. Her agile fingers quickly adjusted the antibiotic dose, while her mind calculated how much longer she could keep up that situation without professional help. The cut on Ethan's forehead now showed red lines, spreading like spiderwebs across his pale skin, a clear sign that everything was getting worse. Silent tears streamed down the nurse's face as she struggled to save that fragile life. "The infection is spreading too fast," Victoria thought, feeling panic rising in her chest. "I can't lose you, little one, not after everything you've been through and what I've heard you say," she murmured, preparing another dose of medication. Ethan thrashed violently in bed, his eyes moving frantically beneath closed eyelids. In his delirium, he relived the moment of the accident in terrifying flashes. Olivia's cruel smile in the rearview mirror, the steering wheel spinning sharply, the impact that sent his small body flying across the back seat. The thermometer marked a dangerously high temperature for such a small body. Victoria filled the bathtub with warm water, knowing she needed to lower that fever at all costs. Carefully, she carried the unconscious boy to the bathroom, her heart breaking at the moans of pain with each movement. The water turned red as she began cleaning the neglected wounds from days on the streets. How can someone do this to a child? Victoria asked the silence of the early morning. Aunt Mary said she needed another one like me. She needed two, Ethan muttered between bouts of fever. Ethan's delirium worsened with every passing minute, revealing dark and increasingly macabre details. In fever-broken words, he spoke of another boy, very similar to him, whom Olivia had prepared before. Victoria documented every word, her hands trembling as she realized the extent of the horror she was uncovering. The cut on the boy's forehead now pulsed with a life of its own, the infection visibly spreading under the translucent skin. There's something much bigger going on here, Victoria thought, feeling a chill run down her spine. She said she needed a replacement. That Daddy wouldn't notice the difference, Ethan whispered through feverish tears. The night advanced relentlessly as Victoria struggled to keep Ethan stable. Each time she checked his vital signs, her heart sank a little further. His blood pressure was dropping, his heart rate accelerating, oxygen dangerously low. In his increasingly rare moments of lucidity, the boy would grip her hand with surprising strength, his feverish eyes pleading for help. "Don't leave me alone," he begged, his voice so weak it was barely audible. "Never, little one." "I'll fight for you until the end," Victoria promised, swallowing her tears. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made Victoria freeze. It was too late for any neighbors, and the steps sounded determined, methodical, as if searching for something or someone. Ethan stirred restlessly in the bed, as if sensing the approaching danger, his words now more lucid despite the fever. "She always finds. She never gives up," he murmured, gripping Victoria's hand with renewed strength. "I won't let anyone hurt you," Victoria whispered, silently locking the door. A dull thud against the door made the small apartment tremble. Victoria quickly turned off the lights, leaving only the faint glow of the heart monitor to illuminate the room. "She won't rest until she finds me," Ethan cried, his body shaking with fear and fever. "We just need to hold on a little longer, Angel." "Just a little longer," Victoria replied, preparing a syringe with sedative. The noise at the door became more intense, and now Victoria could hear voices, a woman giving orders, men responding in low, professional tones. Her heart raced as she recognized the sound of tools working on the lock. Ethan, in his feverish delirium, began to cry softly, reliving the moment of the accident in terror. "Daddy, help me." "She's coming again," he sobbed, his voice broken by fever. "I promise I'll protect you," Victoria whispered, positioning herself between the door and the bed. The infection on Ethan's cut now formed a grotesque pattern on his forehead, red lines spreading like venomous roots. Victoria checked his vital signs once more, her heart freezing as she saw how his blood pressure continued to drop. "Don't let her take me, please," Ethan begged, gripping Victoria's hand with surprising strength. Victoria worked frenetically, disconnecting the equipment and preparing Ethan for a possible escape. Her brain catalogued every possible exit from the apartment, every escape route she could use. The boy alternated between moments of terrifying lucidity and deep, feverish delirium, his words revealing more details of Olivia's macabre plan. "She wanted two like me, to make sure one would survive," Ethan muttered between spasms. "My God, why does it seem from his accounts that this Mari planned this from the beginning?" Victoria realized, feeling her stomach churn. The sounds at the door became more insistent, and now Victoria could hear the metal of the lock giving way. With quick, precise movements, she improvised a barricade with the dresser, knowing it wouldn't hold for long. She knew she was in danger, but if she left with the child, he wouldn't make it. Ethan trembled violently in bed, his small body fighting against the infection that spread relentlessly. "I can't lose you now," Victoria whispered, checking the alarming temperature once more. "Aunt Mary, she always gets what she wants," Ethan replied, his voice fading into a frightened whisper. The cardiac monitor began to beep frantically, showing numbers that made Victoria's blood run cold. The infection was advancing rapidly, and without proper equipment, she knew she was losing the battle. Silent tears streamed down her face as she struggled to stabilize the boy's vital signs. "Please, little warrior, fight a little longer," Victoria pleaded, adjusting the antibiotic. "I'm so tired." "But I don't want to go with her again," Ethan responded, his voice growing weaker. A loud click announced that the lock had finally given way. Victoria could see shadows moving through the crack under the door, hear whispers and orders being given in hushed tones. Ethan stirred in the bed, his small body trembling with a new wave of fever, while muttering words that made her heart clench even more. "She's going to hurt you too." "Like she hurt the other boy," he warned, his feverish eyes focusing on her with chilling clarity. "I won't let anyone in here, little one, I promise," Victoria replied, positioning herself protectively in front of the bed. Meanwhile, Andrew fumbled along the damp basement walls, his eyes slowly adjusting to the oppressive darkness. The smell of mold and dampness was stifling, but there was something else, a metallic odor that made his stomach churn. His fingers found a small cord hanging from the ceiling, and with a feeble tug, a yellowish light illuminated the space. What he saw made his blood run cold. The basement was much larger than he remembered, with several dusty shelves filled with old boxes and, in the farthest corner, a locked chest he had never noticed before. "How did I never notice this down here?" Andrew thought, his legs wobbly from the medication still in his system. "The secrets have always been down here right under my feet," he murmured, dragging himself toward the chest. With trembling hands, Andrew began to examine the trunk. The lock was rusted, but yielded easily when he forced it with a piece of metal found on the floor. Inside, a pile of old photo albums and yellow documents caught his attention. The first album he opened made his heart stop. Olivia smiled sweetly in an old photo, embracing a boy who appeared to be the same age as Ethan, but was not his son. "My God, who is this child?" Andrew whispered, frantically turning the pages. The sound of a door slamming upstairs drew Andrew's attention back to his surroundings. The dim lamplight revealed something he hadn't noticed before, an old vent grate on the far wall. His eyes measured the opening. It would be a tight fit, but perhaps his only chance of escape. Muffled voices from a phone conversation drifted down through the ceiling. "I've taken care of the father." Olivia's voice sounded distant but victorious. "Now I just need more time to take care of everything. No, I'm not giving up. I don't feel good about all I've had to do." Andrew dragged himself to the vent grate, his legs still weak from the sedatives. With effort, he managed to loosen the rusted screws using an old coin found on the floor. The duct was dark and claustrophobic, but he could feel a faint air current coming from somewhere. Before entering, he grabbed a few more documents from the trunk. He needed proof of what he had discovered. "If something happens to me, someone needs to know the truth," he thought, stuffing the papers into his pocket. A metallic noise above made Andrew freeze. Olivia's footsteps were now directly overhead, and he could hear her victorious conversation on the phone. Details about another boy, specific physical descriptions, arrangements being made. Sweat dripped down his face as he tried to control his ragged breathing. "I found the perfect replacement," her voice echoed through the duct. The metal beneath his elbows began to dangerously give way. Andrew tried to distribute his weight, but years of moisture had weakened the duct structure. His fingers found another side grate, perhaps an exit to the outside area of the house. Carefully, he began to inch in that direction. Just a few more meters, he thought, feeling the metal groan under his body. "Please hold. I need to get out of here to understand all of this." A deafening groan of twisting metal filled the air as the duct began to give way. Andrew tried to move faster, but his muscles were still too sluggish from the sedatives. The photos in his pocket scattered as he made a sudden movement. "I can't let this continue," he grunted, reaching for the grate. The air in the duct grew increasingly thin, and Andrew could feel his heart pounding violently against the metal walls. Above, Olivia's footsteps stopped abruptly. Had she heard something? His sweaty hands slipped on the metal as he tried to reach the next duct junction. "There's something wrong down there." Her voice sounded distant but alarmed. "I need to check the basement." He couldn't have figured it out. Andrew felt rather than heard the first screw come loose. The metal groaned in agony, and a shower of rust rained down on his face. With renewed desperation, he tried to crawl faster, ignoring the pain in his muscles. The light from the side grate seemed so close now. "Just a little further," he whispered, stretching his trembling fingers. "Ethan needs me. I can't give up now." A metallic crash reverberated through the duct as more screws began to give way. Andrew could hear Olivia descending the basement stairs, her voice now laced with a rage he had never heard before. The metal beneath his body groaned and contorted like something alive. "How did he find out?" Her voice echoed through the basement. Panic began to set in as Andrew felt the entire duct shudder. Pieces of rusted metal rained down around him, and he could feel the structure beginning to tear away from the wall. His hands found the side grate, his last hope of escape, but it was bolted too tightly. "No, no, no," he muttered, kicking at the grate with his last ounces of strength. "Please, God, I can't die here. I need to know the truth." The sound of rending metal filled the air as the first piece of the duct completely tore free from the wall. Andrew tried to grab onto anything, but his hands found only rust and emptiness. The documents in his pocket, the evidence of Olivia's crimes, swirled around him like leaves in a metallic storm. "Andrew!" Olivia's furious cry came from inside the basement. "You're not going to ruin everything I've built!" Not after all this time. One final deafening crash announced the duct's total collapse. Andrew felt his body begin to fall, twisted shards of metal clawing around him like rusted talons. The world spun in slow motion as he plummeted. Meanwhile, across town, the door to Victoria's apartment finally burst open with a deafening crash. But it wasn't anyone searching for the missing boy who invaded the space. It was 3 rumpled loan sharks from a finance company, brandishing crumpled papers and tense expressions. Ethan, delirious with fever, screamed at the sight of the first man entering. In his sweat-streaked, aged face, he saw Olivia's cold eyes, that same cruel smile that preceded the accident. His small body shook violently on the bed as Victoria positioned herself protectively in front of him. "She's everywhere," Ethan sobbed, gripping Victoria's arm with surprising strength. "Hide me, please." "She brought more people to take me to the dark basement." Victoria kept her professional calm as the debt collectors advanced through the apartment, her eyes alternating between the men and the heart rate monitor, displaying Ethan's accelerated heartbeats. The fever had spiked even higher, and now small blisters were beginning to form around the infected cut on his forehead. The boy thrashed, his glassy eyes fixed on the collectors, seeing in each one a distorted version of his pursuer. "Gentlemen, please, I have a very sick child here," Victoria tried to argue, her voice steady. "Look at their faces, they're all her. Aunt Mary is multiplying," Ethan whimpered, hiding his face under the covers. The leader of the debt collectors, a bald man with a battered leather portfolio, began listing a series of overdue debts, but his voice faded into the air when he saw the state of the boy in the bed. Ethan had started tearing off the bandages, his tiny trembling fingers trying to rid himself of the monitor wires and IV line. In his feverish mind, each wire was a chain Olivia used to bind him, each sensor one of her watchful eyes. "I need to escape before she takes me again," Ethan mumbled, his voice broken by fever. "She'll trade me for another boy, like she did with the one in the basement." The fever began melting Ethan's memories like hot wax, blending reality and nightmare into a kaleidoscope of terror. The walls of Victoria's apartment transformed into the walls of the car on the day of the accident, the ceiling spinning like the world had spun when Olivia wrenched the steering wheel. The collectors, now standing in awkward silence, all bore her face, that sweet smile hiding poison. "Why are you everywhere?" Ethan screamed at the shadows dancing on the walls. "Stop it, Aunt Mary. Stop multiplying. I want my dad." Victoria tried to keep Ethan in the bed while quickly explaining her situation to the collectors. She had a habit of paying for medications for patients who couldn't afford them at the hospital, but the last time she had spent all her rent money so a little girl could survive. She planned to resolve everything as quickly as possible, but there was always someone else in need of her help, and Victoria couldn't help but assist whoever needed it, including the boy in her apartment who continued thrashing as if reliving the accident, his thin arms battling invisible foes. The infection now pulsed visibly under his skin, and each bead of sweat rolling down his face seemed to carry a piece of his memories. "Miss, we didn't know," the bald collector began, taking a step back. "They're lying just like she lies," Ethan warned, his feverish eyes focused on some point beyond reality. Memories began leaking from the corners of Ethan's mind like water. His father's face grew hazier, his voice more distant. In his delirium, he saw Olivia in every corner of the room, her face multiplying like a shattered mirror. Each collector was her, each shadow carried her smile, every sound echoed her sweet, venomous voice. "I can't remember Daddy's face," Ethan cried, his small hands clutching his head. The heart rate monitor began beeping frantically as Ethan tried to get out of bed. His fever-bright eyes scanned the room in panic as more memories dissolved. The way home, the colors of his room, the sound of his father's voice. Everything began disappearing into a feverish haze. "Where is my house?" he asked, his voice rising in desperation. "Why can't I remember the way? What did she do to my memories?" The collectors began backing toward the door, visibly disturbed by the scene they witnessed. Ethan now screamed and cried, desperately trying to recall the way home. Victoria tried to soothe him, but the fever had erected an impenetrable barrier between reality and delirium. "There was a big tree in the yard," Ethan sobbed, pulling at his own hair. "The window in my room. What color was the window in my room? Why don't I remember?" The youngest of the collectors muttered something about coming back another day and quickly turned away. Ethan saw the movement and screamed. On the man's back in his feverish mind was another face of Olivia, smiling that cruel smile. His small hands clutched the sheets tightly as more memory fragments slipped through his fingers. "She's everywhere," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "Even on the walls, even in the shadows. She erased everything." Victoria rushed to prepare more fever medication as Ethan's temperature spiked higher. The boy now alternated between desperate screams and pleas for his father. The collectors, utterly forgotten, silently left the apartment, taking their unpaid debt notices with them. "I need to go home," Ethan begged, his words growing more confused. "But everywhere I remember has her face. Every corner is her smile." The infection now formed a grotesque pattern around the cut on his forehead, as if literally devouring his memories. Ethan clutched his head with both hands, tears streaming down his face as he frantically tried to remember the way home. Each attempt brought only more faces of Olivia, more cruel smiles, more sweet lies. The yellow house. No, it was blue. Or white, he screamed, punching the pillow. Why is every memory one of her lies? Why did she steal my home? The feverish delirium transformed each memory into a new face of Olivia, each recollection into a new cruel smile. Ethan thrashed in the bed, his mind a storm of distorted images and melted memories. Victoria held his hands, preventing him from tearing out the IV line as he continued his frantic search for his lost memories. The big tree, the swing in the backyard. His voice faltered between sobs. Daddy lives somewhere. But Auntie Marie hid him behind all those lies. The last debt collectors hurried out, closing the broken door behind them. Ethan didn't even notice their departure. He was lost in a labyrinth of fragmented memories that transformed into cruel smiles. His fever reached a new peak, and with it came a terrible clarity that made his little body shudder violently. "I remember the house," he suddenly shouted, his wide eyes focusing on something beyond reality. "Daddy, the White House with Keith." His voice trailed off as his eyes rolled back and his body began convulsing. Victoria ran to hold Ethan as he convulsed, his small body arching on the bed, as the last fragments of memory slipped through his feverish fingers. The heart monitor beeped frantically, marking increasingly irregular beats. Amidst the chaos of his collapsing mind, a single crystalline memory emerged. His father's house, but even that last memory began to dissolve into darkness. The house, the garden. "Dad, I remembered," he cried out with his last strength before losing consciousness. "Find me, before she erases everything." Victoria stared at the numbers blinking on the heart monitor and made her decision. Years of emergency experience told her there was no more time. The infection was spreading too fast, and the antibiotics she had at home were no longer enough. With swift, precise movements, she disconnected the equipment and began gathering the essential supplies in her bag, her hands trembling slightly as she separated syringes and medications. "If we don't get to the hospital within an hour, I could lose him," she murmured to herself, checking the last bottle of antibiotics. "But if we go there, they'll ask questions I can't answer." The elevator was broken. Of course it was. Victoria adjusted Ethan in her arms and began descending the 6 flights by the emergency stairwell. Each step echoed against the concrete walls, and she found herself stopping at every strange noise, her heart racing at the possibility of encountering someone. The weight of the boy and the medical bag made her arms tremble, but she couldn't stop. "I should have asked for help sooner," she thought, adjusting the weight in her arms on the third floor. But who? Who would believe this whole story? The parking lot was dark and silent when Victoria finally reached her car. She carefully placed Ethan in the back seat and jumped into the driver's seat, her hands shaking as she inserted the key into the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice, 3 times, and died. She tried again, her foot pressing the accelerator in desperation, but the car stubbornly remained silent. No, 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 not today. She pounded the steering wheel forcefully. Damn old car, why did you choose today to fail me? The light drizzle that had been falling began turning into heavy rain as Victoria ran through the dark streets, Ethan secure in her arms. Her muscles screamed in protest, but every second stopped was a second lost. She knew this area well during the day. At night, with the rain distorting the streetlights, every corner looked like a new maze. I need to get to the main avenue, she muttered, trying to orient herself. There should be taxis there or someone who can help. A car drove slowly past them, its headlights sweeping the sidewalk like prison spotlights. Victoria pressed herself against the wall of a building, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard above the noise of the rain. She waited until the vehicle disappeared before moving again, choosing less illuminated streets. I can't let anyone see us, she decided, adjusting Ethan in her arms. I don't know what happened to this boy. It seems to be something serious. I can't risk putting him in more danger. The rain was now pouring in torrents, turning the streets into dark rivers. Victoria felt her arms going numb, but she couldn't stop to rest. Every minute was precious, and Ethan's fever seemed to rise even with the cold water soaking them. A distant siren made her freeze momentarily. Police or ambulance? If it's the police, they'll arrest me for kidnapping, she thought, hiding in an alley. If it's an ambulance, they might be looking for us. The buildings around began to look strangely familiar. Victoria stopped under an awning to orient herself, and that's when she noticed she was unconsciously following the directions mumbled by Ethan in his delirium. Part of her wanted to ignore this realization, head straight to the hospital, but another part. What if he's actually remembering? She questioned herself, looking at the empty streets. What if these streets can lead us to evidence against her? A thunderclap cut across the sky, momentarily illuminating the street ahead. Victoria hesitated at the corner. To the left was the shortest path to the hospital. To the right, the darker, deserted streets. Ethan's fever was critical, and every minute lost could be fatal. What kind of nurse am I? She whispered to herself, tears mixing with the rain. Taking so long to get a sick child to the hospital. A car drove slowly down the street, its headlights illuminating the puddles. Victoria instinctively shrank back into the shadows, her heart racing as she realized how suspicious she must look. A woman alone carrying an unconscious child in the rain. She needed to find a place to regroup, think about how she would get to the hospital without drawing attention. A partially closed service door caught her eye. It was risky, but she needed a few minutes to check Ethan's vitals. Careful not to make noise, Victoria slipped inside the abandoned building. The smell of mold and neglect made her stomach churn, but it was better than being exposed in the rain. I just need to check his temperature, she tried to convince herself, holding Ethan closer. Then we go straight to the hospital. A metallic sound behind her made her blood run cold. She turned slowly to see a figure emerging from the shadows, a tall man wearing a heavy coat drenched by the rain. There was something predatory in his posture, like an animal that had found easy prey. Well, well, what do we have here? His gruff voice cut through the silence. A pretty lady and a child lost in the night. Victoria took a step back, her arms clutching Ethan protectively to her chest. The man advanced, removing one hand from his pocket. The faint light coming from the street reflected off a knife. His eyes shone with a cruelty that made Victoria's stomach churn. Hand over your bag and anything else of value, he demanded, moving closer. And maybe I'll let you two go, more or less in one piece. The man smiled, a smile that promised far more violence than his words suggested, and took another step towards her. Victoria could feel the wall at her back, knew she was cornered. Ethan trembled in her arms, softly moaning in his feverish delirium. Don't come any closer, Victoria warned, her voice steadier than she felt. This child needs a hospital, and you're not going to stop us. The man advanced with the knife, but Victoria had already located the pile of old boxes beside her. With a swift motion, she kicked the base of the pile, sending an avalanche of cardboard and rusted metal crashing down on the assailant. She seized the precious seconds of his confusion to run for the door, clutching Ethan tightly to her chest. The man cursed behind them, his gravelly voice promising vengeance as he struggled to free himself from the boxes. "That was close," Victoria whispered, running down the dark street. "Hold on, little one, I won't let anyone hurt you." The heavy rain hampered pursuit, but Victoria could hear the man's heavy footsteps not far behind. She turned a corner, then another, her heart pounding in the same frantic rhythm as her feet on the wet asphalt. Ethan shivered in her arms, the fever making his little body burn even through his drenched clothes. When she spotted the wooded area at the end of the street, Victoria didn't hesitate. The trees would offer better cover than the empty alleys. "Come back here." The man's voice sounded more distant now, almost lost amid the roar of the storm. "No one will follow us in this rain," Victoria thought, entering the darkness between the trees. Victoria ran through the rainy night, her footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. The man had been left behind, cursing and threatening after Victoria knocked a pile of boxes between them, gaining precious seconds to escape. For Ethan, the fever made everything distorted. The streetlights turned into faces, shadows danced like monsters, and his father's voice seemed to come from all directions. "Son, come to me," the familiar voice called through the rain. "Daddy?" Ethan tried to lift his head from Victoria's arms, but his neck felt like rubber. Victoria entered a darker area where tall trees formed a natural barrier against the streetlights. The scent of damp earth and leaves mingled with the metallic smell of fever sweat beading on Ethan's face. Each raindrop that touched his skin burned like an ember, and the trees seemed to lean over him, whispering his name in his father's voice. "Ethan, I'm here," the leaves murmured in the wind. "Why don't you come find me, son?" The infection throbbed in his forehead like a second heartbeat, pumping waves of heat through his small body. Ethan began to struggle in Victoria's arms, his burning eyes straining to focus on the shadows between the trees. He was certain he saw his father there, waving to him, smiling that special smile reserved just for his son. "Let me go," Ethan feebly pushed against Victoria's chest. "Dad's calling me, can't you hear him?" Victoria tried to hold Ethan tighter, but the fever sweat made his body as slippery as a fish. His small limbs thrashed with a strength born of delirium, while his glazed eyes tracked something only he could see among the trees. The rain now fell in thick sheets, warping the world into a distorted aquarium. "Easy, little one," Victoria tried to soothe him, her voice almost drowned by the storm's roar. "It's just the fever tricking you, there's no one there." The whole world seemed to pulse to the rhythm of the infection in his forehead. Ethan saw his dad in every shadow, heard his voice in every raindrop. The trees danced around him, their branches twisting into grasping arms. In his fevered mind, every trunk was his father calling him home. "So you promised ice cream?" Ethan shouted at the shadows. "You never break promises, Dad, but why are you taking so long?" A bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the grove for one blinding second. And Ethan was absolutely certain he saw his father standing between two large trees, waving at him with that familiar smile. His small body twisted with renewed strength in Victoria's arms as she struggled not to let him fall into the mud forming under their feet. "Daddy!" Ethan's scream cut through the night like the lightning bolt. "Don't leave again, please. Wait for me." Victoria lost her balance as Ethan flung all his weight to one side, her feet slipping in the wet grass. The boy took advantage of that split second of imbalance to break free, falling to the ground with a dull thud he didn't even feel. The fever had made his body light, almost buoyant. "Come home with me, son." His father's voice seemed to emanate from every tree. "It's time for that ice cream I promised." On shaky legs, Ethan rose and began running toward the shadows. Each step was unsteady, his body careening like a small boat in a storm. The rain washed the sweat from his brow, but couldn't quell the fire raging in his veins. "Ethan, come back!" Victoria's desperate voice grew more distant. "It's not real, little one. It's just the fever fooling you." But Ethan couldn't stop. His dad was out there somewhere between the trees, waiting for him. The forest spun around him like a mad carousel, every trunk multiplying into dozens. His body burned and shivered all at once, drenched by rain that couldn't extinguish the fever's blaze. "Just a little farther," he muttered to himself, stumbling over unseen roots. Dad's here. Somewhere. He always is. The trees seemed to move, parting before her and closing behind, swallowing Victoria's increasingly distant screams. The infection on his forehead pulsed in rhythm with his staggering steps, each beat spreading more venom through his small, exhausted body. "Come, son." His father's voice sounded stronger now. "Let me take care of you, like I always have." The world began to blur at the edges, like a wet photograph dissolving. Ethan could no longer feel his legs, unsure if he was still running or if the ground was moving beneath his feet. His father's voice came from all directions now, multiplied like a shattered mirror. "Why are there so many dads?" he thought confusedly, spinning in circles. "Which one is the real one? Which one will take me home?" The rain turned into a solid curtain of water, isolating Ethan in his own feverish world. He could no longer hear Victoria, no longer knew where the path back was. Every tree now had his father's face, every shadow his smile, every raindrop his voice. "I'm dizzy, Dad," he whispered into the darkness. "Why won't you come get me?" His knees finally gave out, and Ethan fell into the soft mud. The sky and earth seemed to have switched places, and he no longer knew what was rain and what were tears on his face. The fever had devoured all his certainties, leaving only the distant echo of his father's voice. "Daddy." His voice was no more than a whisper now. "Where are you? Everything's spinning." Victoria ran between the slippery trees, her feet sinking into the mud as the rain mercilessly lashed her face. Her heart pounded so hard in her chest it felt ready to burst, but she could not stop. The darkness of the forest swallowed her voice as she screamed Ethan's name, each call more desperate than the last. Years of medical training told her exactly what could happen to a feverish child exposed to a storm like this. "Ethan!" Her hoarse voice could barely rise above the sound of the rain. "Oh God, he won't last long in this temperature." A lightning bolt briefly illuminated the forest, revealing a maze of twisted trunks and treacherous puddles. Victoria tripped on a root, her hands plunging into the cold mud. The bag with medical supplies was soaked, the medicines that could save Ethan now useless in the storm. Her eyes burned with a mixture of rain and tears as she tried to orient herself in the darkness. "Why didn't I go straight to the hospital?" she thought, struggling to get up. What kind of nurse puts a child at risk like this? The wind howled between the trees, turning every shadow into a possible silhouette of the boy. Victoria followed any movement, her heart leaping at every rustle of leaves. The mud clung to her legs like hands, trying to prevent her from advancing, but she continued, guided by the sheer desperation to find Ethan before it was too late. The infection was already critical before he ran away, her professional mind kept assessing. With this rain and cold, he has minutes, not hours. A light object caught her attention amid the mud, Ethan's little shoe floating in a puddle. Victoria picked it up with trembling hands, noticing the stains on the top. The fever must have been so high that he didn't even notice when the shoe came off. Beside the puddle, small footprints followed in an erratic direction. "He's barefoot in the storm," she sobbed, clutching the slipper to her chest. "How could I let this happen?" Guilt weighed on her chest like lead as she followed the footprints, growing farther apart. Ethan was staggering, his steps showing he could barely stand. Victoria could vividly visualize the scene, the feverish boy lost in the dark, calling for a father who wasn't there. "I should have held him tighter," she muttered, struggling against the wind. "I should have foreseen he'd try to run away in the delirium." The footprints stopped abruptly near a clearing, as if Ethan had simply vanished into thin air. Victoria spun in circles, cutting the darkness in desperate arcs. The rain was now falling so hard it was difficult to keep her eyes open, each drop like a tiny needle on her skin. "Ethan!" she shouted again, her voice breaking with exhaustion. "Please answer, please." The second shoe appeared a few meters ahead, carelessly discarded near a fallen log. Victoria ran to it, her legs shaking with fatigue and cold. His temperature was already too high, she thought, panic growing. How long until the fever causes permanent damage? A deafening thunderclap made the ground tremble, and for a moment Victoria thought she heard a distant scream. She ran towards the sound, her feet slipping in the mud as she ventured deeper into the forest. Branches whipped her face, leaving small cuts that stung with the rain. It was that way, she muttered to herself, trying to keep her bearings. Or is the guilt making me hear things? Victoria continued advancing blindly, using the occasional lightning flashes to orient herself. Every second lost was a second closer to disaster, and her medical knowledge only made the situation more terrifying. The infection must be spreading by now, her mind kept calculating. And now hypothermia, dehydration. Why was I so stupid? Her own teeth started chattering with cold, but Victoria barely noticed her discomfort. All she could think about was Ethan alone in the storm, burning with fever, as he called for his father. The trees seemed to close in around her, turning the forest into an increasingly confusing maze. What if he's unconscious? The thought hit her like a punch. How will I find him if he can no longer respond? Victoria tripped on another route, this time falling heavily into the mud. Exhaustion was taking its toll, her muscles trembling with the effort of getting up. That's when she noticed something different. Drag marks in the mud, as if someone small had crawled through there. Ethan must have fallen here, she whispered, following the marks with trembling fingers. At least I know he could still move. The wind shifted direction, bringing with it the distant sound of sirens. Victoria froze, her heart stopping for a moment. She knew that specific siren sound well. In her years of emergency work, she had memorized the subtle difference between police, fire, and ambulance sirens. Did someone find him? She thought, running towards the sound. Or is it? Her thought was interrupted by a new siren sound closer. Victoria began running towards the edge of the forest, her legs finding strengths she didn't know she still had. The rain was starting to let up, allowing her to see the city lights through the trees. That's when the sound of screeching tires cut through the night. "An ambulance!" she exclaimed, finally reaching the street. "Please, let it be him. Please!" The ambulance sped past her at high speed, its red light slicing through the darkness like knives. Victoria stood paralyzed on the sidewalk, Ethan's soaked shoes still clutched to her chest, as she watched the vehicle disappear into the rainy night. The siren faded until it became only a distant echo, leaving her alone with her guilt and despair. Which hospital are they going to? She thought, her legs finally giving way. And will I make it in time to save what's left of him? He waited until he heard the basement door close and the footsteps move away. Leaning against the walls, Andrew managed to reach the small side window that overlooked the garden. With one last desperate effort, he managed to force it open enough to pass through. The cold rain was a welcome shock on his face as he dragged himself through the garden, keeping to the shadows until he reached the garage. "The car keys are still in my pocket," he realized with relief. "I have to get out of here. If my heart is right, if Olivia is lying, my son might be out there somewhere and I'm going to find him." Andrew drove through the drenched city streets, his hands shaking on the steering wheel as he struggled against the despair that threatened to consume him. The fogged-up windshield turned the city lights into watercolor blurs, each headlight a reminder of the precious time he had lost. His eyes burned from searching the empty sidewalks, every alley, every shadow, for any sign of his son. "He has to be somewhere," he muttered, wiping away tears with the back of his hand. "I know he's alive, he has to be. Olivia lied, I know she lied. I would feel it if my son had passed. Please, Ethan, hang on a little longer. Dad's looking for you." The rain pounded the car with renewed force as Andrew roamed the streets aimlessly. The dashboard clock showed it was very late, almost dawn, but he couldn't stop. Every second away from Ethan was an eternity of agony. Every unchecked corner a missed opportunity to find him. "I should have realized sooner," he thought, turning down another unfamiliar street. "How could I have left my son alone for so long and not know she was lying? How could I believe her when she never liked him?" A group of people huddled in front of a bakery, their umbrellas forming a dark constellation against the light from the shop window. Something in his chest tightened when he saw a small figure stumbling among them, a boy soaked and shivering, leaning against the glass. Andrew braked sharply, his heart stopping as he recognized the familiar gait. "Ethan," he whispered, his hands frozen on the wheel. "Please God, let it be him." The boy was barefoot, his tattered clothes clinging to his small frame, and he appeared to be ill. Andrew got out of the car, the rain immediately drenching his face as he approached with trembling steps. The people parted, creating a silent circle around them. Time seemed to freeze as the boy lifted his face. Even through the grime, even with the cut on his forehead, those were his son's eyes. "Dad?" The small, weak voice cut through the sound of the rain. Is it really you?" Ethan staggered a step toward him, his feverish eyes locking onto his father's face. His little hands shook as he tried to stay upright, droplets of sweat and rain running down his flushed face. Andrew fell to his knees on the wet sidewalk, his arms opening automatically. "I can't believe it. My son. I'm here, son," he sobbed, tears mingling with the rain. "Dad's here now." Andrew gathered his son into his arms, a deep sob escaping his chest as he clutched the small body to him. Ethan was burning up. His skin radiated an alarming heat, even through his wet clothes. A woman in the crowd approached, her voice urgent. "I'm a doctor. I've been taking care of him. The fever is dangerously high. He needs a hospital immediately." "Thank you," Andrew managed through his tears. "Thank you for looking after him." "Just promise me you'll save him now," the doctor replied, her own voice choked. Ethan's legs gave out completely, and he collapsed into his father's arms. His small body shook violently, alternating between icy chills and alarming waves of heat. Andrew could feel his heart racing, his breathing shallow and uneven. "Dad, you really came," Ethan whispered against his neck. "I knew you'd find me." Andrew got to his feet with Ethan cradled in his arms, shielding him from the rain with his own body. His son felt impossibly light, as if the fever was consuming not only his health, but his very substance. He ran to the car, every second more precious than gold. "Hang in there, champ," he pleaded, feeling the heat of the fever through the clothes. "Dad's going to take care of you now. It's going to be all right." Ethan's body suddenly convulsed in Andrew's arms, his eyes rolling back as the fever reached critical levels. Hot tears streamed down the boy's face, mixing with the unrelenting rain. Andrew ran even faster, his heart pounding in his chest. "Don't leave me," he whispered to his unconscious son. "Not after I've found you again." With shaking hands, Andrew held Ethan in his arms as the people around the bakery quickly called for help. The nurse who had been caring for him checked his vitals with a worried expression, instructing everyone to give space. Ethan's small body burned with an alarming fever, his breathing growing shallower by the second. "I've called an ambulance," someone shouted from the crowd. "The emergency is on its way. Hang in there." The distant sound of sirens cut through the rainy night, rapidly approaching. Ethan shook violently in his father's arms, his little face contorted in pain as the infection visibly pulsed on his forehead. Victoria ran through the drenched streets, her soaked feet slipping on the asphalt as she followed the sound of sirens. Ethan's other flip-flop, still clutched in her hand, was the only proof that the last few hours hadn't been a nightmare. The small, bloodied and mud-stained shoe weighed like lead on her chest. The rain was beginning to let up, turning into a fine drizzle that allowed the city lights to be seen more clearly. "It has to be him," she thought, running even faster. "Please, let it be Ethan in that ambulance." The red lights flickered in the distance, reflecting in the puddles like beacons of hope. Victoria ignored the exhaustion in her muscles, ignored the scratches from the forest branches on her face. Every second was precious when it came to the fever consuming Ethan. Her years of emergency experience told her exactly how long a child could last with such a high temperature. A small crowd was gathering in front of a bakery, their bodies forming a tense circle around something Victoria couldn't see. Her steps faltered for a moment. What if it wasn't him? What if she had gone the wrong way? The fear of having failed Ethan once again made her stomach churn. "Let me through. I'm a nurse," she shouted, her voice hoarse from calling out for Ethan in the woods. "I need to see if it's him. I need to be sure." The people began to make way as Victoria approached, whispering among themselves about a sick child and a desperate father. Her heart stopped when she saw the small gurney being prepared by the paramedics. That drenched blonde hair, that infected cut on the forehead, she would recognize it anywhere. "It's Ethan," she whispered to herself, tears of relief streaming down her face. Thank God someone found him. It was then that she noticed the man beside the gurney, tall with drenched clothes and a look of pure love and concern directed at Ethan. There was no doubt in her mind that could only be the father the boy kept calling for in his delirium. The way he held Ethan's small hand, how his eyes never left his son's face for a second, said it all. So it's true, Victoria thought, watching the scene. He really does have a father who loves him. It wasn't just fever delirium. The paramedics worked quickly, hooking up monitors and preparing medication. Victoria could hear the numbers being shouted out: temperature, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, all alarmingly bad. Her fingers gripped the small sandal she was still holding, debating whether to approach or remain in the shadows. "The infection has spread too much," one of the paramedics warned. "We need to move him now, or we're going to lose him." Ethan's father stepped into the ambulance without taking his eyes off his son, his hand still entwined with the boy's. Victoria took a step forward, her legs shaking with exhaustion and emotion. She needed to tell him about these past few days, about how she had tried to save Ethan, about the things the boy had revealed in his delirium. "He needs to know the truth," she murmured to herself. "He needs to know about the woman who tried to hurt his son." The ambulance doors began to close, and Victoria felt panic rising in her chest. Soon they would be gone, taking Ethan and all the answers she needed with them. Her hands trembled as she held the stained sandal, the only physical proof she had of that unbelievable story. "Wait!" Her voice came out weaker than she intended. "There's something you need to know." One of the paramedics was already climbing into the vehicle when Victoria finally found her professional voice. Years of emergency work gave her the authority needed to make everyone stop and listen. "I'm a nurse. I cared for him these past few hours. The infection started at least 3 days ago, and he had prolonged exposure to the rain." "Come with us," the paramedic gestured quickly. "We need all the information you can give us." Victoria climbed into the ambulance just in time, the doors closing behind her as the siren began to wail. The space was cramped, full of equipment and people, but her eyes were fixed on Ethan's father. The man looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and confusion, clearly wanting to ask 1,000 questions. "Thank you for taking care of him," he whispered, his voice choked. "I'm Andrew, and I need to know everything that happened to my son." The ambulance tore through the city at high speed as Victoria watched the paramedics battle to stabilize Ethan. The boy was still delirious, calling out for his father, even unconsciously. His small body trembled with the fever that refused to break, the infection now a visible dark line beneath his skin. "He never gave up on finding you," Victoria said softly to Andrew. "Even at his worst, he knew you would come." The monitors began to beep more urgently as Ethan had another seizure. Victoria watched helplessly as the paramedics worked, her hands clutching the little sandal like a talisman. At her side, Andrew looked ready to crumble, his face a mask of terror and love. "Blood pressure dropping," one of the paramedics yelled. "Step on it, we're losing him." Victoria's eyes met Andrew's through the chaos of the ambulance, and in that moment, she knew she would have to tell him everything. About the mysterious woman, about the revealing delirium, about the days of fever and fear. But right now, in this moment, all that mattered was that Ethan had found his father. "He's strong," she whispered, more to herself than to Andrew. "He has to be, after everything he's survived." Andrew's eyes never left his son, his hand firmly grasping Ethan's small one as the doctors worked around them in the emergency room. The steady beep of the heart monitor was both a comfort and a torture. Each blip made his heart jump. Victoria was leaning against the opposite wall, still drenched from the rain, watching the doctors battle the infection that was consuming the boy. "The temperature's not dropping," one of the doctors murmured, changing out the cold compresses yet again. "We need to get more aggressive with the antibiotics." With gentle movements, Victoria approached Andrew, her years of emergency experience telling her this father needed to understand what had happened. She pulled up a chair and sat beside him, still clutching Ethan's stained little sandal like it was something precious. "I found him passed out in front of the bakery 3 days ago," she began, her voice low and gentle. "He had a fever too high for a regular hospital. I could see in his eyes he needed protection, not bureaucracy." Andrew listened to every word Victoria said, without taking his eyes off Ethan, his hands trembling slightly as he stroked his son's damp hair. The nurse described the days of struggling against the fever, the sleepless nights changing compresses, the moments of lucidity when Ethan called for his father. "You saved his life," Andrew whispered, tears silently rolling down his cheeks. "If it weren't for you, I don't even want to think." With that, Andrew excused himself and grabbed his phone with shaking hands, knowing he needed to alert the police about Olivia. As he dialed, Victoria's words about Ethan's delirium echoed in his mind, along with all the evidence he had found in the basement. By his side, his son fought against the fever, as the doctors worked tirelessly. "I need to report a crime." His voice came out hoarse but firm on the phone. "My wife's. She tried to kill my son and faked his death. I need someone to go to my house right now." The officer on the other end of the line asked several questions, and Andrew answered them all, his eyes never leaving Ethan's feverish face. He provided the address of the mansion, described Olivia, explained about the documents he had found in the basement. Victoria watched in silence, realizing that the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together. "Her squad car is on its way to your residence," the officer informed him. "Keep your phone close by. An investigator will contact you as soon as they have news." As soon as they arrived at the hospital, Ethan was taken to the ICU room. He was restless in the bed, his little body shivering with another fever spike. The doctors moved quickly, adjusting medications and checking vital signs. Victoria automatically stood up, her nursing instincts causing her to critically assess the monitors. "Temperature rising again," one of the doctors alerted. "The antibiotic isn't being enough." Andrew tried to stay calm as more doctors entered the room, bringing equipment and discussing new treatment protocols. His hands never left Ethan's, as if that contact was the only thing keeping his son anchored to life. "He's strong," Victoria tried to comfort him, seeing his growing despair. "He survived 3 days alone on the street with this infection. He'll overcome this too." The monitors began to show increasingly worrying numbers. The infection, which had previously concentrated on Ethan's forehead, was now forming visible dark lines descending down his neck. The boy breathed with increasing difficulty, his chest rising and falling at an irregular pace. "Oxygen saturation is dropping," one of the doctors announced. "We need to intubate if it doesn't improve in the next few minutes." Victoria explained to Andrew each procedure the doctors performed, trying to turn that medical chaos into something understandable for a terrified father. She described how she had cared for Ethan in her home, the feverish delirium, the boy's surprising strength even so ill. "He never stopped believing you would come," Victoria said softly. Even at the worst of the fever, he knew his father hadn't abandoned him. Ethan's tiny body began to shake more violently, his hands gripping his father's with a strength born of delirium. Andrew leaned over his son, whispering words of comfort as the doctors ran to control another crisis. "Dad's here, son," he murmured close to Ethan's ear. "I won't let anything bad happen to you ever again." The phone rang again. More news from the police. No sign of Olivia, no clue of her whereabouts. It was as if she had dissolved into the rain that night, leaving only destruction in her wake. Andrew barely registered the investigator's words, his eyes fixed on his son's feverish face. "How can someone do this to a child?" he thought aloud. "How could I have been so blind?" The monitors began to beep frantically as Ethan's body arched on the bed, his eyes rolling back as violent spasms took over his little body. The doctors moved as a single unit, years of training making their actions almost automatic. "Seizure!" one of them shouted, preparing medication. "We need the space, everyone out now." Andrew refused to let go of his son's hand, even as the nurses gently tried to pull him away from the bed. It took Victoria holding his shoulders, her professional yet gentle voice cutting through his panic. "They need space to work," she insisted, pulling him back. "Let's wait outside. It's best for Ethan now." The last moments before being forced to leave the room would forever be etched in Andrew's memory. Ethan's tiny body convulsing violently on the huge bed, the deafening sound of the monitors, the urgent voices of the doctors overlapping. Victoria practically dragged him out, her own tears mingling with his. "Please," Andrew murmured to no one in particular as the doors closed. "Please, don't take my son away from me again." The hours dragged like centuries in the hospital hallway, each minute an eternity of anguish, as Andrew and Victoria awaited news. The sun was beginning to rise, its first rays timidly penetrating the hospital windows, when the doctor finally emerged from the emergency room. His tired face broke into a small smile that made Andrew's heart leap in his chest. "He's a warrior," the doctor said, consulting his notes. "The antibiotics that were administered in the last few days saved his life." Andrew felt his legs grow weak, needing to lean against the wall as he absorbed the news. Victoria remained by his side, her own tears of relief silently streaming down. The doctor explained how the initial treatment had prevented the infection from spreading further, giving Ethan the fighting chance he needed. "If it weren't for your quick actions," the doctor said to Victoria, "we would have lost him." "I only did what anyone would have done," she replied, her voice choked up. The nurses began to prepare Ethan to be transferred to a private room. His small body, once burning with fever, now rested more calmly between the white sheets. The new dressing on his forehead covered the infection that was finally starting to subside, and his breathing had normalized. "The temperature is stable," a nurse reported, adjusting the IV. "The worst is over, now we just have to wait for him to wake up naturally." Victoria explained to Andrew how she had found Ethan, how her instinct as a nurse and as a human being had prevented her from simply handing him over to the system. Her eyes never left the heart monitor, which now showed strong and steady beats. "He never stopped fighting," Victoria said softly. The early morning hours brought a different kind of peace to the hospital room. Andrew occupied a chair on one side of the bed, Victoria on the other, both watching every small movement of Ethan. The doctors passed by regularly, always surprised by the boy's rapid recovery. "His vital signs are growing stronger," one of them commented. "It's as if he knows he's safe now." The sun was already high in the sky when the first real change happened. Ethan's fingers twitched slightly, squeezing the hands that held his. Andrew and Victoria exchanged hopeful glances, leaning over the bed simultaneously. The boy's eyelids fluttered, struggling against the weight of medicated sleep. "Son?" Andrew called softly, caressing Ethan's hair. "I'm here with you, champ." Ethan slowly opened his eyes, blinking a few times to adjust his vision to the room's light. His gaze found his father's face first, and a weak but genuine smile lit up his still pale features. His small hand squeezed his father's with surprising strength. "I knew I'd find you, Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse but audible. "You never break your promises." Tears streamed freely down Andrew's face as he kissed his son's forehead, now cool and fever-free. Ethan turned his face to the other side, recognizing Victoria with another smile. His eyes, once clouded by fever, now shone with lucidity and gratitude. "Thank you for taking care of me, Nurse Dawn," he said, squeezing her hand too. "My name is Victoria, my love," she replied, smiling through her tears. The doctors came in to check on the boy once more, impressed by Ethan's rapid recovery. The boy answered all their questions clearly, his strength visibly returning with every minute. The bandage on his forehead was changed, revealing a scar that was already healing properly. "It's amazing how resilient children are," one of the doctors commented, "especially when they have so much love and care around them." Victoria began to rise, sensing it was time to give the reunited family some privacy, but Ethan's hand held her with surprising firmness. His eyes, still tired but determined, begged her to stay. Andrew reached his free hand across the bed, holding hers gratefully. "Stay with us," Ethan pleaded, his voice still weak but full of affection. "You're family now too." The hospital room filled with the golden light of morning, enveloping the three in a moment of perfect peace. Ethan alternated glances between his father and Victoria, as if he wanted to make sure they were both real, no longer fever delusions. His smile, even tired, lit up the room more than the sun. "Now yes," he whispered, his eyes beginning to grow heavy with sleep again. "Now I'm really home." Ethan's fingers relaxed slightly as he drifted back to sleep, but this time it was a peaceful, restorative slumber. Andrew and Victoria remained at their posts, each holding one of the boy's hands, their own gazes meeting across the bed in a silent promise of eternal protection. "He'll never be alone again," Andrew softly vowed. "Never again," Victoria agreed, gently squeezing the small hand in hers. A week had passed since Ethan had woken up in the hospital. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting golden patterns on the boy's face, now healthy and rosy again. Victoria was organizing the last details of his medical discharge, while Andrew watched his son playing with a new toy car, a gift he had bought to replace the one left behind under the sofa at the mansion. "We can go home tomorrow," Victoria smiled, adjusting the last bandage on Ethan's forehead. "The fever hasn't returned for 3 days, and the infection is completely under control." Andrew's phone vibrated in his pocket. It was the investigator in charge of the case. His heart raced as he answered the call, his eyes fixed on Ethan, still absorbed in his play. The officer's words made his legs grow weak. Olivia had been found trying to board an international flight with forged documents. She tried to run. We searched for the criminal for days, but we managed to find her. Now she won't hurt anyone else, the investigator assured him. We found enough evidence at the mansion to keep her locked up for a long time. Andrew hung up the phone and sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, his hands trembling slightly. Victoria noticed the change in his expression and discreetly gathered her things to leave the room, but Andrew silently gestured for her to stay. His son looked at him with those green eyes, so much like his own, now free from fear and fever. "We need to talk, son," Andrew began, his voice choked. "There's so much I need to tell you." Andrew took a deep breath, his teary eyes fixed on his son as he mustered the courage to begin. Ethan set down the car and scooted closer to his father, his small hand instinctively seeking Andrew's. Victoria remained silent in the corner of the room, her own tears beginning to form as she sensed the crucial moment about to unfold. "Son, since your mother left us, I've been trying to be both father and mother, trying to fill a void that seemed impossible to fill. When Olivia came into our lives, I thought we had finally found the family you deserved. But I was so wrong, so blind. I let her manipulate me, like poison being administered in small doses. I didn't notice when the medicines started, when the lies began, when my own son began to disappear before my eyes." Andrew paused for a moment, swallowing the lump in his throat. Ethan squeezed his hand as if to say it was okay to continue. "When I lost you, when I thought I had lost you forever, it was like the whole world had lost its color. Nothing made sense anymore. The silence of the house was deafening. Each of your forgotten toys on the floor was a stab in my heart. And then I discovered the truth in the basement. I discovered who she really was, and the guilt. The guilt almost killed me. How could I not see? How could I let someone hurt what I hold most precious in life?" Tears were now freely streaming down Andrew's face, but he continued, needing to get everything out that was stuck in his chest. But then God or fate or whatever force exists in this universe put an angel in our path. Victoria, this incredible woman who risked everything to save a boy she didn't even know, who saw beyond the fear and fever, who fought against the infection that was consuming my son when I wasn't there to fight, who spent sleepless nights changing compresses, applying medicines, being the mother you truly deserved to have. Andrew extended his free hand towards Victoria, who approached the bed with silent tears rolling down her face. "You, Victoria, gave me back not only my son, but my entire life. There are not enough words in the world to thank you for what you did for us. You didn't just save Ethan, you saved our family. You gave us a second chance that I don't know if we deserve, but for which I will be forever grateful." Turning back to Ethan, Andrew continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "And you, my son, my little warrior, forgive me. Forgive me for not being there when you needed me most, for not noticing the signs, for allowing that woman into our lives. Forgive me for every tear you shed alone, for every night you spent afraid, for every moment you doubted your father's love. Because this love is the only true and constant thing in my life." Andrew held Ethan's small face between his hands, looking deeply into his eyes. "I promise that from today on, it will be different. There will be no more lies, no more fear. It will be just us, you, me, and Victoria, if she accepts to be part of our family. Because family is not who blood determines, it's who love chooses. And the three of us, we chose each other through pain, struggle, and hope." Wiping away the tears with the back of his hand, Andrew concluded, "The police just called. She's been arrested, son. Olivia will never come near you again. She will never hurt anyone else. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you only have happy memories from now on, because you are my miracle, Ethan. My little miracle who survived against all odds, who never lost faith in your father, even when your father lost faith in himself." Ethan looked at his father with bright, tear-filled eyes, his small hand still firmly holding his. The afternoon sun created a golden halo around them, as if the light itself wanted to embrace this moment of redemption and new beginnings. "I will never stop loving you, Dad," Ethan whispered finally. Victoria approached closer, enveloping father and son in a protective embrace. The forgotten toy car on the bed was the only silent witness to that moment when three broken hearts began to heal together, united by a love stronger than any pain. "Now I want to be a friend of the family. I want to be part of your family, and you can count on me for whatever you need. Ethan smiled through tears. The day of discharge arrived sunny and bright, as if the very sky celebrated Ethan's victory. Andrew was organizing the last documents at the reception, while Victoria helped the boy get dressed to finally leave the hospital. The small bandage on his forehead was now just a reminder of what they had overcome together. "Ready to go home, champ?" Andrew asked, entering the room with the discharge papers. "Only if Victoria promises to visit us," Ethan replied, holding the nurse's hand. Victoria smiled as she packed Ethan's last belongings into the backpack, her white coat already indicating that she would return to work as soon as they left. The pediatric ward would be more colorful now, transformed by the experience she had with the little warrior who conquered her heart. "I promise to visit whenever I can," she assured, adjusting the collar of Ethan's shirt. "And you can come see me here too, now that I'm officially your favorite nurse." The path to the car was full of goodbyes. Every nurse, every doctor, every staff member who had witnessed Ethan's miraculous recovery made sure to give a hug, a handshake, a smile. The boy walked hand in hand with his father and Victoria, now no longer a patient but a symbol of hope for the entire team. "You changed this hospital. Did you know that?" one of the doctors commented to Victoria. "It was him who changed us," she replied, looking fondly at Ethan. In the parking lot, it was time for the temporary farewell. Victoria knelt in front of Ethan, adjusting the bandage on his forehead one last time, a gesture that was now more one of affection than medical necessity. The boy hugged her tightly, burying his little face in her white coat. "Will you come over for dinner today?" Ethan asked hopefully. "Today I'm on duty, but I promise that this weekend I'll make a delicious soup. I'm sure you'll love it," she replied. Andrew watched the interaction with a heart full of gratitude. Victoria had become more than the nurse who saved his son. She was an angel that fate had placed in their lives at the darkest moment. His gaze met hers, conveying without words all the gratitude he could never express. "I'll never be able to thank you enough," he began. "Seeing him smiling like that is all the thanks I need," Victoria interrupted. The trip home was filled with promises of visits, invitations for Sunday lunches, and plans for the future. Ethan chatted in the back seat about how he wanted to show Victoria his room, how she needed to see his toys, how fun it would be when she came to visit them. "We can make a special spot for her in the garden," Ethan suggested excitedly. "Of course, son. Victoria will always have a special place in our home," Andrew agreed. Victoria returned to her routine at the hospital, but now with a different sparkle in her eyes. She managed to get an advance on her pay to cover the rent, and most importantly, continued helping everyone she could. Every frightened child who arrived received not only medical care, but also the kind of attention that had made a difference in Ethan's life. Her colleagues noticed the change. She had always been an excellent nurse, but now there was something more. "You have a special gift," the doctors would comment. "I learned from the best teacher," she would reply, thinking of Ethan. Victoria's visits became bright spots in the family's new routine. On weekends, she brought not only her loving presence but also hospital stories that made Ethan laugh, medical advice disguised as casual conversations, and a kind of affection only she knew how to give. "For Victoria's soup is the best in the world," Ethan would declare on every visit. "It's because it has a secret ingredient," she would wink. "Lots of love." Ethan's recovery progressed in leaps and bounds. The bandage on his forehead was soon removed, leaving only a scar that would gradually become just a distant memory. His smile, once shy and frightened, now lit up the entire house. "Look, Dad, you can barely see it anymore," Ethan would say, checking his forehead in the mirror. "And you've become even more handsome, champ," Andrew would reply, ruffling his hair. Victoria kept her promise to always be around, striking the perfect balance between her professional life and her new family of the heart. Her night shifts alternated with afternoons of storytelling in the garden. Routine appointments became excuses for long hugs. "You're our guardian angel," Ethan would always say whenever she arrived. "And you're my family of the heart," she would reply, covering him in kisses. The house became a home again, not by returning to normalcy, but by building something new and more beautiful. Ethan's laughter echoed through the hallways. Victoria's visits brought new life to every room, and Andrew could finally sleep peacefully, knowing his son was safe and loved. "We're a different kind of family, aren't we?" Ethan commented during dinner one night. "We're a perfect family in our own way," Andrew replied, as Victoria smiled in agreement. 6 months after coming home, life had found its own perfect rhythm. The scar on Ethan's forehead had become just a faint silver line, and the memories of those dark days were now like a distant nightmare that lost its power with each new dawn. Victoria continued her work in the hospital's pediatric ward, where she became known for her special care with frightened children. Every Thursday without fail, she would have dinner with Andrew and Ethan, a tradition that began naturally and that none of them dared to break. Her weekend shifts were always brightened by surprise visits from the little patient who changed her life, bringing drawings and stories to share. Andrew transformed the old mansion into an entirely new place. The basement was sealed and turned into a storage space. The walls were painted in cheerful colors chosen by Ethan, and the garden bloomed with the plants Victoria suggested to aid the boys' full recovery. The house was now truly a home, filled with laughter and genuine love. Ethan returned to school, where his story inspired changes in how the institution dealt with children in risky situations. His smile shone brighter than ever, and his ability to trust people, especially his father, grew stronger with each passing day. Nights of nightmares were replaced by colorful dreams, and fear gave way to the security of being truly loved. On a particularly beautiful Sunday afternoon, as Victoria prepared her famous soup in the kitchen and Andrew helped Ethan with his homework, the boy made an observation that perfectly captured the essence of his new life. "You know, Dad," he said, looking up from his notebook, "sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, right?" Andrew glanced toward the kitchen, where Victoria hummed softly as she cooked, and then at his son, whose green eyes shone with a wisdom beyond his years. "Yes, son," he replied, hugging him. "The best families are exactly those." Victoria smiled from the kitchen, her heart overflowing with love for that little family fate had gifted her. The aroma of soup filled the house, mingling with the scent of colored pencils and new books, the perfect fragrance of happiness. And so, in a house filled with light, love, and homemade soup, 3 hearts that fate had united through pain found their own version of happily ever after. They say the greatest love stories are born from the greatest pains. For Ethan, Andrew, and Victoria, the journey through fear and darkness led them to a light brighter than they ever imagined finding. The scar on Ethan's forehead remained as a subtle reminder, not of Olivia's lies or the feverish nights, but of the strength of true love that united them. Because sometimes you have to get completely lost to find your way back home, and sometimes angels appear wearing white coats, with stethoscopes around their necks and hearts big enough to save not just one life, but an entire family. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We greatly appreciate having you here with us. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, full of valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.